Fourth and final part of this week's lecture, we're going to talk about the importance of conflict management. And I'm not going to repeat everything that you read in Shevchuk and some of the other readings because that material is very solid and I encourage you to read it. But I just want to highlight some things here. When conflict arises in the church, we often have two things going on that will ultimately undermine the unity of the body and its peace. One is that we address the conflict too late in the cycle. We wait until the conflict is too great. The second is we seek only to manage conflict, to deal with symptoms instead of resolving it. And the latter is particularly critical because of the cyclical nature of conflict. We'll go to that in just a little bit. Avoiding conflict actually denies the church some aspects of maintaining its health, because there are benefits to conflict. It can lead a person to personal growth and maturity. It permits the venting of frustrations. It permits or stirs up the status quo so that we begin to see where we are have shortcomings. I like the old expression, status quo is the Latin for the mess we is in. It also is a time to strengthen relationships because people stand together and begin to find ways of overcoming their differences. They often become stronger in their relationships. And it also means it helps the church see other sides. Now, the failure to manage or resolve conflict generally has, or definitely has a downside because there's dangers in avoiding conflict. Needed changes are not made. Resentment is built up. Frustrations often are taken out on others. Discontentment, gossip, and backbiting grow, and the blessings of the Lord, I'm going to tell you, disappear when you don't deal with conflict. Shevchuk tells us that there is a conflict cycle, and that first one is when tension arises. We begin as a person to sense that something's not quite right. Something is out of kilter. At first, we may be the only person who recognizes it, but we just know that something isn't quite right. But after a while, if we don't address it, then if we don't say, I think there's a problem, then we begin to have what we call that role reversal or dilemma. Because no one else recognizes it, we begin to ask, and it seems crazy, but we begin to ask, what's the matter with me? Why is everybody else so happy and I'm so unhappy? But again, if we don't speak about it, if we don't identify or name that there's a conflict, even if we can't name it specifically, the third stage arises, so the third step in the cycle, which is where injustices begin to be gathered. Whenever somebody does something now that contributes to our discomfort or our frustration or our sense of conflict, we begin to blame them for the conflict. Sooner or later, when the injustice gathering gets the greatest, we come to that next step, which is conflict or confrontation, where it really comes to the surface and you can no longer ignore it. It's out there and people are taking sides and doing battle. Shevchuk, however, tells us that we can't stay in conflict forever. We just don't live that way. Sooner or later, there has to be a ceasefire. We just get tired and retreat for a while, and we make adjustments because we can't stay in conflict forever. But if we have not worked to resolution of the conflict, the reality is that adjustment is only temporary, and that adjustment will actually carry seeds to create the next conflict because another one will arise, and part of what will arise is the frustration over the last conflict. Now, something to remember is that we have conflict management styles. We all have sort of a default style that we fall into, but there are at least 5 styles to conflict, and they're on that grid that you see from Speed Lease in the supporting documents. There's compromise. That's where we have a moderate sense of another's interests, and we have a moderate sense of our own interests, and we can kind of live with each other. There's compete, where we really don't concern that much about what other people think or their interests. We just think of ours. We want to win. Then there is accommodating. We think the other person is, well, I can get along with them because my feelings don't matter, even though they do. There's avoiding, in which we really don't want to think about their interests, but we also don't want to get our interests put out there on the table and risk, so we just withdraw. We avoid it. And that's a surefire way to have a conflict go greater. Sometimes withdrawal or avoiding is necessary until attitudes, emotions lower, but if you don't address the conflict, you have problems. And finally, is collaboration, or what I might call resolution. We have a high interest in the other person's having their interest represented and our interest represented, and we work together to find something, perhaps a new ground where we can all embrace because we're all blessed by it. The challenge is to discern when to apply each to a conflict. And that interpersonal conflict, that's something that really has to stay personal. And you have to encourage people to talk one another or even help them talk it over. Methods or preferences or program really require quite often simply some find a way to live together constructively with both sides' interests being taken care of. And of course, the core values is when there has to be a win. Now, ultimately, that brings us to dealing with antagonists, what Kenneth Hawk calls alligators, what Steve Corning calls dangerous people. And I want you to read those two monographs that are in the file as well. They have some good descriptions about that. And if you have particular questions about antagonists, I would be glad to talk about that at a later point, but I'm not going to take time in the lecture because almost everything I would have to say is that you can read what those men have said, and they have very sound advice. But just remember, there are some people in the church who simply are not well emotionally. They are incapable of seeing the needs or the position of others. They are threatened by everything that doesn't simply affirm them. They have real problems, and they will always be antagonists to you and to the church because they think that they have to be satisfied. The reality is, however, even if you try to satisfy them temporarily, they are never fully satisfied. They just are antagonists by nature. Some are actually sociopaths. Wow, you ever thought about that? Some of the body are sociopathic, and they have no moral scruples at all. Read those readings. If you have some questions, please send them to the discussion board. And I hope that what we've said today and what we read this week will be of help to you as you deal with change and crisis and conflict, as together we seek to build the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace.